And we're live. Well, welcome back to the Bells Club podcast. I'm your host, David Bell. And on today's episode, we'll be taking a look at round 10 of the 2025 Formula One World Championship, with this week's Grand Prix being held at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in Canada. So, let's get ready for those 5 green lights, and we'll be underway. So, now we're going to kick this week's episode off with FP1 and FP2. So, within the first, say, 3-ish minutes of the first practice session, a yellow flag has already been waved, or was already waved, as Franco Colapinto actually spun his car while starting the flying lap, and the actual spin occurred at the exit of the pit lane. But the spinning itself was quite a weird one, because he didn't actually touch anything. He didn't go into the grass, he didn't touch any curbs, and there was no oil or standing water on the track. He just looked like he just lost the rear end and kind of spun it out. But then, after around 14-ish minutes of runtime in the first session, is when we saw things kind of heat up or spice up a little bit, with the first of the red flags actually being waved because of Ferrari's Charles Leclerc actually crashed on the entrance to turn 3 or 4. Now, from the onboard cameras, it looks like he was on a fast-paced lap. He was kind of running a bit hot, his front right wheel, and couldn't actually make the turn in time and smashed up the whole right side of his car. And in doing so, because he carried so much momentum into the corner, he did end up settling up against the barrier on the far side of the track. Then, other than Leclerc's actual crash, the rest of the session was relatively uneventful, with the top 3 fastest drivers of the session being Verstappen in P1, call it P1, Albon in P2, then Sainz in P3. Now, I did have a note here to say, hopefully, this was a good omen or a good sign for how the Williams were going to do in the race on Sunday. But we'll dive into that a wee bit later, and we all know kind of how that actually turned out. Then, due to his crash in FP1, Charles Leclerc actually missed out on the second practice session, and because his crash in FP1 was kind of so early in the session, he basically missed out all competition or all sessions on Friday, because his car was just so badly damaged. Then in the actual crash itself, it didn't just break his wheels or suspension and front wing, it actually damaged the actual car chassis, so that needed to be changed. And because the FAA only inspects the car once a day for the safety reasons, even if they did get the car repaired in time, they wouldn't be able to take part in the session because they couldn't get that second chassis inspected in time. Then, within the first 10 minutes of the second practice session, we saw yet another incident, but this one was involving Lance Stroll. So this one was kind of similar to Colapinto's in terms of Stroll was on a kind of fast lap. He was entering one of the corners, and there was already 3 cars kind of ahead of him. He did try to pass them, and he ran a bit wide, brushed up on the grass, or brushed up against the barrier, and there was heavy contact, which again smashed up the whole left side of his car, and his suspension just collapsed on him. Then FP2 was basically a carbon copy of FP1, just changed the drivers who actually crashed, where after Stroll's crash, the rest of the session was quiet, it was uneventful, and our top 3 drivers of that session were Russell in P1, Norris in P2, then Kimi Antonelli in P3. So, moving away from the Friday, we're going to have a look at Saturday for the third practice session and qualifying. So, we're going to look at FP3 first. So, say the first 20-ish minutes of the session was again quiet, with teams just practicing or testing out different run plans versus tire types, fuel loads, kind of the usual testing stuff, really. But during that kind of quieter session, it was kind of funny to hear the commentators kind of give Nico Rosberg kind of shit when he actually made contact with his teammate Lewis Hamilton back when they were teammates back in the day, especially here in Canada. So also during the session itself, Oscar Piastri seemed to be the first casualty of the day, where he made some contact with the wall of champions and punctured his rear wheel. But luckily he was actually managed to get back to the pits for them to change tyres, alter the car if need be, and he continued on the rest of the session as normal. But it was on the previous lap from Piastri's where we saw Nico Hülkenberg actually spin his car 360 degrees. But luckily, he managed to actually keep it out of the barriers. But in saying that, he did have a little bit of contact with it, with his rear and front wing, their end plates, kind of getting damaged from the wall. And that was the same corner a lap later where Piastri would get his puncture. Then, at the end of that final practice session, we saw our 3 top fastest drivers, being Norris in P1, Leclerc in P2, then Russell in P3. Now, we're going to look at some qualifying stats now. So, at the start of Q1, we actually saw, or we were actually told, that Yuki actually received a 10-place grid penalty for overtaking Piastri under red flag conditions, and that happened in FP3. But during, say, the last 6-ish minutes of Q1, the helicopter cam got a perfect view of Albon's car when his engine cover basically just disintegrated off the car. Then from the ground broadcast cameras, it gave us a wee brief view of the beating heart of those modern F1 cars. And for all the engineering guys out there, I'm sure that was beauty to see. But with the engine cover actually coming off the car, it didn't hinder Albon in any way, or he was able to make it back to the pits. His team were able to fit a new engine cover, and he did manage to complete a final lap in time, so he did make it into Q2. But at the end of that session, we did lose 5 drivers, those being Bortoleto, Sainz, Stroll, Lawson, and Gasly. Then for those of us who were watching the drivers' press conferences after second qualifying, or after first qualifying, my bad, we actually heard from some comments from Sainz about his issue or incident with Isaac Hadjar, and to be fair, he didn't seem too happy about it, and which, I mean, it's completely understandable, as Hadjar actually impeded Sainz, which cost him a little bit of time, which that bit of time would have saw him into Q2, and God knows where he would have ended up after that, if he would have made it into Q3 or gained pole position, who knows. But he will have just had to make up those places on Sunday. Then, at the end of that second qualifying session, we did lose our final 5 drivers, those being Yuki, who's going to start from the pit lane on Sunday, who did start from the pit lane on Sunday. Then we lost Colapinto, Hülkenberg, Berman, and Ocon. Then, in the final qualifying session, or Q3, again, itself was a quite uneventful session, with, these being the top 10 drivers in the world at what they do. They rarely, if ever, make mistakes. But it was on the closing laps where Leclerc actually had set the first and second sectors purple, but unfortunately, he did have a tad bit of oversteer when he was going into the third sector, which caused him to back out of the lap or abort the lap, which unfortunately did land him in P8. But then it was Russell at the very last fucking second that stole pole position away from Max Verstappen by a 1/10 of a second, who, because of that, started in P2 in the race. Then they were followed by Piastri in P3. So now we're going to look ahead to Sunday for the race itself, or the Canada Grand Prix. Now we're going to look at the race itself. So when the race actually started, we saw Hadjar starting further back from where he finished in qualifying. Now this was due to him being given a 3-place grid penalty for that impeding of Sainz in Q1. Now, it's a bit, yes, he was disciplined for it, but again, it was a bit shit that Sainz did end up missing out in a potential higher qualifying finish. The best comparison I probably have for this race would be maybe Japan earlier in the year, in terms of this race itself was kind of a snooze fest. It was fun at the start, as every race kind of is. You expect people to chance their arm at some overtakes at the very start. Then it didn't really kind of pick up until maybe lap 65, 60, between 65 and 68, kind of closer to the end. But in between that, Alex Albon was complaining all race about engine problems, or him himself, but really the people who were Mercedes had like their engines supplied by Mercedes. On around lap 48, he actually did have to pull off into one of the park up kind of areas, and retire the car. So I'm sure this weekend would be a weekend that Alex Albon kind of wants to forget. Then I know they're not a Mercedes engine kind of partner, or they're not supplied by Mercedes, I don't think. But another car that was struggling with engine problems all weekend during the race was Liam Lawson. But he was told over the radio that he had to pull into the pits because his team wanted to retire the car with a power unit failure. Then again, we didn't really see much action up until, say, the last kind of closing laps. But it was beautiful to see the battle between the two McLarens on the closing laps, with Norris attempting overtakes on Piastri on around, say, lap 67. Then Piastri taking the position back right in the following corner. But now is when the tides turn, when Lando, or what it looks like from Lando's onboard camera, he does run wide onto the grass and collide with the wall, smashes up, again, his whole left side, suspension, front wing, left wheel in the actual overtake attempt, which ended his race then and there. But from multiple other angles, from the broadcast cameras, from even Piastri's onboard camera, it does look like Norris hits Piastri's back wheel. And even looking at Piastri's back wheel, you can see marks from the contact. But the argument could be made, is the contact what made Lando run wide? Or did he run wide, then make the contact with Piastri? But the FAA, it looks like they have ruled it as just a racing incident, and they didn't take any further action in that race or in next week's or in the following race. But the downside is Lando did just fuck off a load of points, not only for himself in the Drivers' Championship, but also for his team in the Constructors. Yes, they are over 150 points clear of the Ferrari in second, but he's just fucked off a load of points for them either way. Then because Lando's crash did happen so close to the end of the race itself ended, or had to end, under a safety car. Which, I mean, it is shit to see. We want the drivers to race as much as possible, but it's one of the things that needed to happen. But now, for the fourth win in his career, George Russell wins in Canada. Now, George was followed up on the podium by Verstappen in P2, and for the first time in his Formula 1 career, and I'm sure we'll not see the last of this, Antonelli in P3. And, well, that will do us for this week's episode of the Bells Club podcast. I want to thank you all for listening to this week's episode. And if you feel like you've enjoyed, please feel to follow us here on wherever you get your podcasts. And I look forward to talking to you all on the 29th for round 11 or the Austrian Grand Prix. Goodbye, everybody.